Hello, and welcome to this video on the interview itself. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the previous video on the introduction to investigative interviewing. We will also follow this with two videos on detecting deception. I think you'll find this information to be straightforward and thorough. So without further ado, let's get right to it. The first step in the planning stages of your interview is preparing the physical environment. It should be neutral and comfortable. Make sure that your physical appearance is professional but relaxed. The next thing to consider is the comfort zone of the personal space of the subject that you're interviewing. There are generally 4 levels of distance. There's touching, up to 20 inches, which is for your spouse and close family and friends. There's casual, which is from 1 to 5 feet. This is probably the environment, the distance you'll have with your subject when you're interviewing them. There's impersonal, which is 4 to 12 feet, such as an office setting. Then there's public, which is 12 feet or more. The next aspect to consider is the climate. It should be productive. It should be supportive, non-judgmental, spontaneous. Be sure there's no deception and that you're sticking to issues and facts. You want to develop mutual trust and have an ability to understand the emotions, attitudes, and ideas of the person that you're interviewing. The defensive environment would be one where you're placing blame or making moral judgments, trying to manipulate or trick, or being apathetic or otherwise condescending. Before starting the interview, you should ask these 3 questions at least. The first is, do you have all preliminary questions to cover all topics? Do some background on the underlying circumstances and events, and perhaps on the person that you're speaking with as well. You never know if you're going to have a chance to see this person again. So making sure you have all questions that you can have available is important. The second question is, have you considered the depth and scope of the answers for each of your questions? This is going to be important in determining how long you need to speak with the person and the amount of attention you need to maintain in that person. The last one is, at least, how do the questions impact the person emotionally and or with the rapport with your subject? That can be key to making sure that your interview is as productive as it can be. Question sequencing is my favorite aspect of interviewing. It contains 5 tools, which I think you'll find to be very powerful in getting the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The first is the open-ended question, such as, tell me what happened. The answer is going to be very open and generic, but it does give you some idea of how much the person knows, their frame of reference, and any priorities that they may have. You want to listen intently and communicate this back to your subject. You want them to dig as deep as possible. This will also help you determine what follow-on questions to consider. And typically, our second type of tool here is the closed-ended question. You typically follow these from the open-ended question. These can be multiple choice, such as was the light red, green, or yellow. Be sure, though, by doing so that you don't lead the person into a classification or an answer they might not otherwise give. There's the bipolar, such as yes or no, for confirming or clarifying something. There's more of a generic type of question, such as how tall are you? These questions save time and they give more control over the flow and pace of the interview. It does make it easier to write things down, but it can also slow your interview process as well. They're good for reconstructing an event or gaining information from a person who's shy and may be reluctant to get started and become comfortable with you. These questions, though, are easier to falsify because you're basically letting the person know exactly what type of answer you're looking for. The next we have in our series of tools here is the funnel question. Here you start with an open-ended question and then you follow on with a series of closed-ended questions. This helps to build the big picture and to clarify specific and important points or to confirm what was said. The reverse funnel is where you start with a closed-ended question and then follow up answers with an open-ended question. Specific committals that you get from a closed-ended question can be important to higher generalizations. They can also get someone to open up, as in the case of the shy person, and to get specifics about things that are stored in memory. Very often, closed-ended questions can really prod memory very effectively. And then there's alternate sequencing. You can use open funnel, funnel questioning, reverse funnel. Just start with closed-ended or open-ended. It depends on your situation. I think as a effective interviewer, you'll probably be able to figure that on your own. But I think it's extremely powerful. Moving along with question sequencing is what I call the big six. I think probably the most overlooked aspect of interviewing. It's the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Each of these words can be used to drill down on many different dimensions and facets of your underlying factual event or circumstance. So try to consider these 6 words in your interview. The next is your voice, pitch, volume, and pace. This can set the mode and the atmosphere of your interview. The more you speak softly or at a slower pace or in a lower tone of voice will denote that your topic requires attention and that it's important. Speaking more quickly or with more volume or with a higher tone of voice can be used to kick up attention, especially in topics that may be not as important and where there's lots of information to get through. You can also use these to transition from one of those 2 states to the other. If you need to slow down and get the attention for an important topic, you can do that. When you want to transition out of that into something else, that's something that you can do, and it's very, very effective. Transitioning. Be sure you flow from one point to the next to interconnect and link each area of questioning. This helps the logical flow and lets the person know that you're listening. It also helps to keep their attention. It's often best to summarize what the person has said, to paraphrase it back to them, and to maybe quote them directly back if you think that's appropriate to do so. Moving on now to some common mistakes that we should definitely avoid. The first is the compound question, or the 2 questions at once. Oftentimes, if you do ask 2 questions in succession, your subject will focus on the last question, or they might become confused. So this is something to avoid. Try to make sure your questions are stated separately, and that you get a proper answer from each of them. Then there's the famous leading question. This is where your question suggests an answer, like, it was you who committed the crime, right? This can cause people to answer in ways that wouldn't be truthful otherwise, and maybe even have them come to believe that the answer they gave is the truth. There's the emotionally loaded question, which suggests that some response is expected, such as, you wouldn't mind giving to the homeless fund, would you? There the person would obviously feel maybe emotionally guilty if they didn't respond a certain way. The last one that's the most important, I think, is observation versus inference. Did this person, your subject, actually experience the event? Did they hear things, see things, and so forth? Or is it something that they were told? Or maybe an inference that they drew from something else that someone said, or some other aspect that they experienced that they are now drawing some inference from? So it's important, I think, to make sure that you be able to separate these things and make sure you understand what was actually observed or experienced and what might have been inferred from what other people said or other circumstances that led to an inference that may or may not be truthful. Listening is our next topic and is certainly arguably one of the most important aspects of your interview. It's mostly common sense as well, but it's again often overlooked, and the more you pay attention to it, I think the better results you'll have. First, of course, listen carefully. Pay attention to the details and the flow. Try to acknowledge what the person is saying. Say, I see, I understand. This communicates that you're listening and helps to keep your train of thought. Maintain eye contact to show your interest, but do so appropriately, obviously, not too much or too little. And then, of course, don't be too distracted, like doodling or looking at your smartphone. This doesn't give the person you're talking to much confidence in the fact that you are paying attention and that their responses are used to you. Stay focused. Try to stay on one issue at a time. And often, as I've said before, paraphrase your answer back. That, of course, lets the person know that you're listening, but also make sure that there's no lost information, as we talked about in our previous video. Follow-up questions are the last aspect of our tool set with doing interviewing. Be sure to clarify or repeat the question if necessary. Ask the subject to elaborate. Again, think back to our question sequencing topics. Clarify any inconsistencies in the subject's responses. Remember, you may not have a chance to speak to this person again, so be sure you're walking away with what you need. Be sure to use neutral phrases so that you're not suggesting anything or coming across as being judgmental and so forth. Also utilize silence if you can. Sometimes stopping and waiting for a response encourages the person to think about what they're going to say and to be thorough and truthful about what they're saying. That's it. We've come to the end of our second video in our series in investigative interviewing. We've covered a lot. We covered the planning stages, how to start the interviewing, some neat stuff on question sequencing, some mistakes to avoid, how to engage in active listening, and then follow-up questions. Before we leave, though, I'd like to cover a few closing remarks here. If you're new and want to get your skills, you want to refine them, practice with colleagues. Come up with a fictional situation or scenario that has enough meat in it that it can leverage the use of all of the tools and information that we've covered. You be the interviewer and have a colleague be the subject, or vice versa. There's no really better way to kind of kick the tires on how you and others perform in this very active and dynamic environment. The second thing is we're all human. I think that early on I found myself feeling that I didn't get the information that I needed, or that during the interview I might have done something that I could have done differently. And really, being relaxed and confident is really important. So don't try to be all things to all people, and don't worry about mistakes. I found it to be very helpful. I would also mention that we are going to cover deception, that we have 2 videos on that topic. As I'm talking to people, sometimes I begin to see behavior that looks evasive or deceptive. Now, this is not an exacting science, and we'll discuss that. It may or may not be anything, but it can be good information because there are some things that are kind of tried and true that give us some notion of what the person's thinking. And what we don't cover, as I indicated in my last video, is that there's certain topics at this point that don't really lend themselves to a video presentation. So things like eyewitness evidence and interrogation, at this point in time, I think are best left to written form or formal training and so forth. That may change, and we may likely have podcasts on those topics as an alternate way of presenting that. So do watch our podcast page. If you do want more information on me and this video and other aspects of what we do, go to investigativeinterviewing.com. Thank you very much.